Peter the Great is a name that evokes mixed feelings in every Russian. Was he a great reformer or a destroyer of traditions? The creator of an empire or the gravedigger of Holy Russia? For 300 years, historians have been arguing about this czar, but few dare to ask the main question. What if Peter did not modernize Russia at all, but systematically destroyed its soul? What if one of the darkest pages in our history is hidden behind the glittering facade of Europeanization? Today we will try to find answers to these uncomfortable questions. If you are interested in this topic, subscribe to our channel. We continue to explore the hidden pages of Russian history. And in the comments, write whether you consider Peter the Great to be the savior of Russia or its destroyer. This question still divides the historical community, and your opinion is also important. In 1725, a man died who forever changed the course of Russian history. Peter the Great went down in history as a great reformer, creator of an empire and a fleet, and founder of St. Petersburg. But there is another side to his reign that people prefer to keep quiet about. Behind the glittering facade of Europeanization lies the systematic destruction of ancient Russian culture, traditions, and the historical memory of the people. The Tsar's contemporaries left evidence of strange orders coming from the royal palace: burn old books, ban traditional clothing, demolish ancient churches, change the calendar, and even the way of counting years. All this was presented as a necessity for modernization, but Peter's true motives remain a mystery. Diplomat Just Jules wrote in his diary, "The Tsar is acting as if he wants to erase all memory of the former Russia." What compelled the monarch to destroy the heritage of his ancestors with such cruelty? What secrets were hidden in the ancient manuscripts that had to be destroyed? And why did the Tsar's European advisors insist on a complete break with the past? The answers to these questions shed light on one of the darkest pages in Russian history. Peter the Great did not simply reform the country. He carried out a cultural revolution, the consequences of which we still feel today. And the deeper we study the documents of that era, the clearer it becomes that the great reformer was hiding something that could have called into question the entire official version of Russian history. Foreign observers noted the unusual haste with which the reforms were carried out. It was as if the Tsar was afraid that someone would prevent him from completing what he had begun. The French ambassador Campredon wrote, "His Majesty is destroying ancient customs with the same passion with which others create them." What was the reason for such persistence? The first alarm bells rang back in 1698, when the young Tsar returned from the Grand Embassy. He brought with him not only knowledge of European customs, but also a clear plan for reform. A plan that envisaged a complete break with Moscow traditions. The old boyars immediately sensed a threat. They understood that this was not about simple reforms, but about a change in the civilizational paradigm. And they were right. Peter started small, with beards and clothing, but gradually worked his way up to the most sacred things: faith, language, the calendar, and historical memory. The mystery of Peter's reforms lies in their systematic and radical nature. The Tsar did not simply borrow Western innovations, he methodically eradicated everything that was traditionally Russian. And he did so with a special, almost fanatical persistence that suggests hidden motives for his actions. The first act of cultural genocide was the destruction of ancient Russian chronicles and annals. In 1701, a wave of seizures of ancient manuscripts from monasteries and boyar houses swept across the country. Officially, this was explained by the need to put in order historical documents. But the true goal was different. A witness to those events, the monk Serapion of the Trinity Sergius Lavra, secretly wrote, "The Tsar's men arrived and ordered all ancient books to be collected. Those who did not hand them over voluntarily had them taken by force." The collected manuscripts were taken to Moscow, where a special commission under the leadership of foreign advisors selected what to keep and what to burn. The chronicles containing information about the origins of Russian princes, ancient traditions, and ties with Byzantium were particularly affected. Entire collections disappeared, including the famous Stepanaya Kniga and many local chronicles. The modern historian Nikolai Karamzin later wrote, "Peter deprived us of many precious monuments of antiquity that could have shed light on the dark pages of our history." But the most surprising thing is the selectivity of the destruction. Documents glorifying military victories and strengthening the authority of the Tsarist regime were preserved. Texts describing ancient customs, the traditional structure of society, and alternative versions of historical events were destroyed. It was as if someone knew in advance exactly what needed to be erased from the people's memory. The Jesuit Francisque Emilian, who lived at Peter's court, left an interesting note. "His Majesty believes that the people should know only that part of the past which serves the present." This phrase reveals the Tsar's true attitude toward history as a political tool. The past had to justify the present, not cast doubt on it. Texts relating to ancient freedoms and the rights of various social classes were particularly carefully destroyed. The charters of Free Novgorod, documents on the self-government of the Cossack regions, and records of traditional forms of local self-government disappeared. Everything that could serve as a basis for resistance to absolutism was methodically confiscated and burned. Monastery libraries were particularly severely damaged. Elder Dosify of the Solovetsky Monastery wrote, "They took from us not only secular books, but also ancient spiritual books that our grandfathers had copied. Unique texts of the lives of saints, descriptions of miracles and traditional rituals disappeared. Orthodox culture lost a significant part of its written heritage." It is curious that documents confirming the coordination of these actions with the Tsar's European advisors have survived. Saxon diplomat Georg Grund wrote bluntly, "It is necessary to deprive the Russian people of their historical memory, so that they will more easily accept the new order." It turns out that the destruction of the chronicles was not a spontaneous act, but a well-thought-out strategy. The war against the Russian identity began symbolically, with beards. In 1705, Peter issued a decree on compulsory shaving, which his contemporaries rightly perceived as an attack on Orthodox identity. In Russian tradition, the beard was not just an element of appearance, but a sign of belonging to the Orthodox faith and the ancient customs of the ancestors. The Tsar personally cut off the beards of his courtiers at a New Year's celebration, turning a ritual sacred to Russians into public humiliation. Prince Boris Kurakin, a contemporary of the events, wrote, "The sovereign seemed to deliberately insult everything that was sacred to the Russian people. This was not a reform, but an act of symbolic violence against national identity. Those who tried to preserve their traditional appearance were particularly persecuted." The beard tax ranged from 60 rubles for nobles to 1 kopeck for peasants, sums that were unaffordable for many. But it was not about money. The authorities forced people to publicly renounce the faith of their fathers by changing their appearance. Protopope Avvakum warned back in the 17th century, "Whoever shaves his beard renounces the image of God." Peter understood perfectly well the symbolic significance of his actions. He deliberately broke the spiritual bond between generations, forcing his subjects to look like Europeans and, consequently, to think like Europeans. Along with beards, traditional Russian clothing was also banned. Boyar fur coats, kaftans, sarafans, and kokoshniks were replaced by German and French dresses. A decree issued in 1707 required people to wear German, French, or Saxon clothing, under threat of a fine or even imprisonment. Special guards appeared on the streets to cut off the long sleeves and hems of violators. French Ambassador Campredon noted with surprise, "The Russians are becoming Europeans by force, not of their own free will." This was the first time in history that an entire people had been forced to change their clothes. Women's clothing underwent particularly radical changes. The traditional Russian sarafan, which covered the figure from neck to toe, was replaced by low-cut European dresses. The Old Believers rightly saw this as an attack on moral foundations and family traditions. Many women preferred not to leave their homes rather than dress like devils. The Church tried to resist. Patriarch Adrian wrote to the Tsar, "It is not fitting for Orthodox people to imitate heretical customs and wear clothes that expose the ruin of the soul." But the voice of the Church was ignored. Moreover, a reform of the Church organization itself soon followed. The psychological effect of these changes was devastating. People lost the external signs of belonging to their culture and gradually lost their inner connection with tradition. European clothing required European manners, and a European appearance shaped European thinking. Peter achieved his goal. Russians became pseudo-Europeans. The destruction of the traditional education system was one of the most painful blows to Russian culture. Before Peter's reforms, education in Russia was based on Orthodox principles and the study of Church Slavonic. Children learned to read from the Psalter and the Book of Hours, simultaneously mastering literacy and the basics of the faith. This system produced not just literate people, but bearers of Orthodox culture. Peter declared such education backward and harmful. In 1708, a decree was issued to close traditional church schools and replace them with secular schools based on the European model. Education was transferred to the civil alphabet, and Church Slavonic was excluded from the curriculum as unnecessary archaism. New schools were established under the guidance of foreign teachers who not only did not know Russian traditions, but also openly despised them. Christian Wolff, a German who led the educational reforms, wrote, "Russian children must forget the barbaric customs of their ancestors and learn to think in a European way." Education became a tool of denationalization. Religious education suffered particularly badly. The study of the lives of saints, church history, and Orthodox theology was reduced to a minimum. Instead, Latin, European history, and Protestant philosophy were introduced. The young Mikhail Lomonosov later recalled, "We were taught everything except our own faith and history." The system of compulsory education for noble children abroad completed the task. Young Russian aristocrats lived for years in Europe, where they completely lost touch with their native culture. They returned not as Russians, but as cosmopolitans, for whom their native traditions seemed strange. This is how a pro-Western elite was formed, alien to its own people. The destruction of old textbooks was carried out with a thoroughness worthy of better causes. Not only religious texts were removed from circulation, but also secular works that glorified Russian exploits and traditions. The Tale of Peter and Favronia, The Life of Alexander Nevsky, and tales of Russian heroes were all declared fables unworthy of an enlightened mind. New textbooks were written by foreigners and translated from European languages. Russian history was presented as a series of dark ages before the arrival of Peter the Enlightener. The achievements of ancient Rus were either ignored or presented as borrowings from the West. This is how a complex of national inferiority was formed among the educated classes. Monastic schools, which had been training educated Orthodox Christians for centuries, were closed one after another. They were replaced by secular schools, where the law of God was taught formally, and the main focus was on useful sciences, arithmetic, geometry, and military affairs. Spiritual education was replaced by technical education. The result was not long in coming. Within a generation, the Russian nobility spoke French at home, despised their native culture, and considered themselves Europeans who had happened to be born in Russia. The gap between the educated society and the people became a chasm that ultimately led to the revolutionary upheavals of the following centuries. Peter's church reform was a veritable cultural revolution that undermined the foundations of Orthodox civilization in Russia. In 1721, the Tsar abolished the Patriarchate, which had existed since 1589, and replaced it with the Holy Synod under the control of the secular authorities. The Russian Church lost its independence and became an appendage of the state apparatus. The last patriarch, Adrian, foresaw the coming changes and wrote a will before his death. "Keep the faith of your fathers. Do not allow the sacred to be defiled for the sake of worldly gain." But his words were not heard. After the patriarch's death in 1700, Peter simply did not appoint a successor, leaving the church without a leader for 21 years. The synod that was created in its place was headed by Theophan Prokopovich, a Protestant by origin, who openly preached ideas alien to orthodoxy. He claimed that the Tsar's power did not come from God, but from a social contract, and that the church should serve the state, not the other way around. These ideas were fundamentally at odds with the Orthodox tradition of the harmony of powers. Monasteries were particularly harshly targeted. Their numbers were drastically reduced, and those that remained were placed under strict state control. Monks were forbidden to copy books or engage in educational activities. Many ancient monasteries were turned into military hospitals or factories. The Trinity Sergius Lavra lost most of its land and treasures. The Old Believers, whom the Tsar regarded as the main obstacle to his reforms, suffered particularly badly. The Old Believers preserved ancient traditions and refused to accept innovations. For this, they were subjected to severe persecution, double taxation, and forced to wear special clothing for identification. Many fled to the forests or emigrated to Poland and Turkey. Worship also underwent changes. New rites borrowed from Protestant churches were introduced. Traditional singing was replaced by Western-style part singing. Icon painting was simplified under the influence of secular painting. Even church architecture had to conform to European tastes. Instead of traditional onion domes, Baroque spires were built. The clergy became civil servants. Priests received salaries from the treasury and had to report on their activities to secular officials. The secrecy of confession was violated. Priests were required to report state crimes heard in confession. This undermined the foundations of pastoral ministry. Church lands were confiscated en masse for the benefit of the state. Monasteries lost their economic independence and became beggars for state aid. Ancient monasteries, which had served as centers of culture and education for centuries, fell into decline. Many unique architectural monuments were destroyed or rebuilt beyond recognition. The result was a deep trauma to the Orthodox consciousness. The Church lost its authority among the people, who saw clergymen turn into obedient officials. Faith was transformed from a living source of spirituality into a formal ritual. This crisis was not overcome in the following centuries, which largely predetermined the future catastrophe of Orthodox civilization in Russia. One of the most insidious blows to Russian culture was the calendar reform of 1700. Peter did not simply change the way of counting time. He stole more than 5,000 years of history from the Russian people, declaring the current year to be not 7,208 since the creation of the world, but 1,700 since the birth of Christ. This was not a technical reform, but an ideological diversion against the historical consciousness of the people. The old Russian calendar counted from the creation of the world and linked Russian history to the biblical tradition. The Rus's people saw themselves as part of the sacred history of humanity, heirs of Adam and Eve, Noah, and Abraham. The new calendar severed this connection, leaving only 1,500 years of real history. Everything that existed before Christ seemed to cease to exist. Moreover, Peter moved the beginning of the year from September 1st to January 1st, severing the connection with the church calendar and Orthodox traditions. The September New Year was associated with the cycle of agricultural work and church holidays. The January New Year imposed a European rhythm of life that was alien to the Russian agricultural way of life. Along with the calendar, the perception of time also changed. Russian people were accustomed to thinking in cycles, from sowing to harvest, from fasting to feasting, from birth to death and resurrection. The European linear calendar destroyed this cyclical nature, imposing a view of time as a mechanical process devoid of sacred meaning. The reform hit the peasantry, which made up the overwhelming majority of the population, particularly hard. Peasants continued to live according to the old calendar, but official documents, taxes, and duties were calculated according to the new one. This created constant confusion and conflict between the people and the authorities. People felt like strangers in their own country. Church holidays also suffered from the reform. Many ancient commemorative dates were forgotten or moved. Traditional folk festivals and fairs associated with church holidays lost their temporal reference. The centuries-old rhythm of folk life associated with the Orthodox calendar was destroyed. It is symbolic that Peter ordered the first day of the new year, 1701, to be celebrated with fireworks and European entertainment. This was a conscious rejection of traditional Orthodox celebrations. Instead of prayers and church services, there was secular entertainment. Instead of spiritual renewal, there was mechanical merriment by decree from above. The calendar reform also had a psychological effect. People began to perceive their own history as short and insignificant. Whereas before, a Rusin could say, "We live in the year 7,208 since the beginning of the world," now they had to say, "We live in the year 1701. The scale of historical time shrank several times over. The old believers rightly saw the calendar reform as a sign of the coming of the end times. they continued to live according to the old calendar, which further separated them from the official state. Thus, the schism in Russian society between those who accepted the innovations and those who clung to ancient traditions deepened. The calendar reform became one of Peter's most successful projects in recoding Russian consciousness. By changing the system of chronology, he changed the perception of history and Russia's place in the world process. It was a quiet but very effective cultural revolution, the consequences of which we still feel today. Peter's language reform dealt a crushing blow to the cultural identity of the Russian people. In 1708, the Tsar introduced a new civil script that was radically different from the traditional Church Slavonic script. This was not just a technical modernization, but a conscious break with a written tradition that had existed in Russia for more than 700 years. Church Slavonic was not just a means of writing, it was the sacred language of Orthodox culture, in which many generations of Russian people prayed, thought, and created. Each letter of the Church Slavonic alphabet had a sacred meaning and a numerical equivalent. The new font destroyed this symbolic system, turning writing into a simple technical tool. The letter Yat was particularly affected, as it distinguished between subtle shades of meaning in words. Its abolition led to an impoverishment of the language and the loss of many subtle semantic differences. The words est and est, lechu and lechu, ceased to be distinguishable in writing, which made it difficult for future generations to understand classical texts. At the same time, a flood of foreign words poured into the Russian language, displacing the original vocabulary. Instead of ratni lyudi, warriors, soldiers appeared. Instead of sudei, judges, justitsi, instead of prikazov, orders, kolegi. French, German, and Dutch terms replaced Russian concepts even where it was completely unnecessary. Court officials were required to speak a mixture of Russian, French, and German. A special salon jargon emerged, which was used by the Europeanized nobility. Prince Antioch Cantemir wrote bitterly, "We have become foreigners in our own country, speaking a language that our peasants do not understand." Book printing in Church Slavonic was severely restricted. New publications were printed in a civil font, which made them inaccessible to people who could only read Church Slavonic. This created a gap between the educated class and the people, between the new and traditional cultures. Translations of European literature filled the book market, displacing original Russian works. Not only scientific works were translated, but also entertainment literature that was alien to the Russian mentality. Gallant novels and philosophical treatises formed a new type of consciousness, detached from Orthodox roots. Church Slavonic was declared obsolete and unsuitable for modern life. Its study in schools was reduced to a minimum. The younger generation grew up without understanding the language of their ancestors, in which chronicles, lives of saints, and spiritual literature were written. Cultural continuity was severed. The ban on the use of Church Slavonic in official documents was particularly painful. Decrees, laws, and diplomatic correspondence were translated into simple Russian with abundant borrowings. This deprived state activity of the sacred dimension it had in the pre-Petrine era. The language reform had far-reaching consequences. It created two parallel cultural worlds, an elitist, Europeanized one, and a traditional, folk one. These worlds spoke different languages, read different books, and professed different values. This split became a time bomb that would explode in future revolutions. Peter himself made no secret of the goals of his language policy. In a letter to Feofan Prokopovich, he wrote, "The Russian language must be made similar to European languages so that our thoughts may also become European." This was a frank admission that language reform was a tool for changing national consciousness. The architectural heritage of ancient Rus was systematically destroyed during Peter's reforms. The Tsar viewed traditional Russian architecture as a symbol of backwardness and barbarism that needed to be replaced with European models. The result was the loss of many unique monuments that had been created over centuries and embodied the spirit of Orthodox civilization. Moscow, the ancient capital that embodied the continuity of Russian statehood, suffered particularly badly. Peter ordered the demolition of many churches and palaces to make way for new buildings in the European style. Entire neighborhoods of wooden houses with their unique carvings and traditional layouts disappeared. The Kremlin underwent particularly brutal reconstruction. Ancient chambers were converted to European needs, and traditional interiors were destroyed. The Tsar ordered part of the Kremlin wall to be demolished to build a European-style arsenal. Only the resistance of the Muscovites prevented the complete destruction of the historic ensemble. Church architecture underwent particularly radical changes. Traditional five-domed churches with onion domes were declared inelegant. Instead, Baroque churches with high spires and Western decor were built. St. Peter and Paul Cathedral in the new capital became a symbol of this architectural revolution. Iconostases in ancient churches were replaced by new ones in the European style. Traditional icon painting was replaced by secular painting with elements of Western art. Sacred images lost their canonical rigor and became decorative paintings. This destroyed the spiritual function of the temple space. Wooden architecture, which formed the basis of Russian architectural tradition, virtually disappeared from cities. Peter banned the construction of wooden houses in the center of St. Petersburg and other large cities, requiring the use of stone and brick. The unique technique of wooden construction, which had developed over centuries, was declared a relic of the past. Foreign architects invited by the Tsar did not understand or appreciate Russian traditions. Domenico Trezzini, Bartolomeo Rastrelli, and other masters created magnificent buildings, but in a style foreign to Russia. Their creations were technically perfect, but lacked a Russian soul and did not reflect the national character. The demolition of ancient monastery complexes was particularly painful. Many monasteries that had existed since the 14th to 15th centuries were destroyed or radically rebuilt. Unique monuments of wooden architecture disappeared. Refectories, cells, chapels that embodied the ideals of Russian orthodoxy. Folk dwellings also underwent forced Europeanization. The traditional izba, with its well-thought-out layout and symbolic decoration, was replaced by regular houses based on European designs. The red corner with icons was replaced by salons with European furniture. The house ceased to be a sacred space and became a simple dwelling. Landscape gardening completely changed its character. Instead of traditional Russian gardens with their natural layout, regular parks in the French style were created. Peterhof and Tsarskoye Selo became symbols of this transformation. Nature was tamed by geometry and subjected to a rational order. The architectural reform resulted in the loss of the national character of Russian cities. They became similar to European cities, losing their unique appearance that had developed over centuries. Architecture ceased to be an expression of the national spirit and became a demonstration of power and wealth. This was another blow to Russia's cultural identity. The mass recruitment of European specialists to educate Russians became one of the most controversial aspects of Peter's reforms. The Tsar truly understood the need for technical progress, but the methods used to achieve it proved destructive to the national culture. Foreign teachers did not simply impart knowledge, they shaped a new way of thinking that was alien to Russian traditions. The sending of young nobles to study in Europe was particularly painful. In 1714, a decree was issued on compulsory education for noble children abroad. Young people spent 5 to 7 years in Europe, completely losing touch with their native culture. They returned no longer as Russians, but as Europeans in spirit and worldview. Count Boris Sheremetev wrote bitterly about his son. He left as a Russian boyar and returned as a French marquis. He speaks to his father through an interpreter and calls his mother a backward peasant woman. This was a typical situation in aristocratic families. A European education destroyed family ties and the traditional hierarchy of values. Thousands of foreign specialists worked in Russia, who not only did not respect local traditions, but openly despised them. Saxon engineer Georg Broin wrote home, "Russians are barbarians who must be forced into civilization by force. Their ancient customs are only worthy of laughter." This attitude created an inferiority complex among Russians. Foreign teachers received disproportionately high salaries and privileges compared to Russian craftsmen. This created the impression that everything European was, by definition, better than Russian. Young people absorbed this attitude and began to be ashamed of their own culture, striving to imitate Western models in everything. The influence of European governesses in aristocratic families was particularly destructive. French and German tutors instilled in children the idea that the Russian language was crude and unsuitable for educated communication, that Orthodox Christianity was a backward religion, and that Russian customs were barbaric remnants of the past. This is how a generation of Europeans was formed, who despised their own homeland. The technical knowledge that Russian students acquired was indeed useful, but it was taught in isolation from the national culture and the Orthodox worldview. Russian engineers and officers became bearers of alien values, which created a deep internal conflict between professional knowledge and spiritual needs. The language barrier exacerbated the problem. Most foreign specialists did not know Russian and worked through interpreters. This hindered the transfer of knowledge and created an additional distance between teachers and students. Russians felt like second-class citizens in their own country. European specialists often imposed not only their professional methods, but also their way of life. Russian students adopted European manners, clothing, and entertainment, without understanding that behind the outward glamour lay spiritual emptiness. They became superficial imitators who lost their own identity. The result was the formation of an educated society that was Russian only by origin. These people thought in a European way, spoke foreign languages, and despised their own people. They became conduits of Western influence in Russia, destroying traditional foundations from within. Peter got what he wanted, a Europeanized elite, but paid for it with the loss of national unity. The paradox was that many European teachers were mediocre specialists who could not find employment in their own countries. In Russia, they became experts and imposed their often dubious methods. Russian talents were ignored or suppressed as backward and unprogressive. Monk Ioan Maximovich wrote these prophetic words, "You need to teach, but don't forget about the soul. Otherwise, we'll end up with people who know everything but understand nothing. That's exactly what happened. European education gave Russia technically skilled people, but stripped them of their spiritual roots and national identity. One of the most mysterious pages of Peter's reign was the story of Ivan the Terrible's legendary library. This unique collection of ancient manuscripts, including Byzantine chronicles, Arabic treatises, and Latin codices, disappeared without a trace during Peter's reign. The official version stated that the library was lost in a fire, but surviving documents tell a different story. Ivan IV's library was formed throughout the 16th century. It included manuscripts brought from Byzantium by Sophia Palaiologina, ancient Slavic chronicles, translations of ancient authors, and unique historical documents. Many texts existed in a single copy and contained information that could shed light on the dark pages of Russian and world history. In 1702, Peter ordered the creation of a special commission for the examination of ancient books. It was headed by the German Johann Schumacher, who knew neither Slavic nor Greek. Under the pretext of cataloging, the systematic removal of the most valuable manuscripts began. Many of them were never seen again. Documents concerning the origins of the Russian state and its ties to the Byzantine Empire were of particular interest. Chronicles proving the antiquity of Russian statehood and its independent development from Western influences disappeared. Genealogical tables tracing the Russian princes back to the Byzantine emperors rather than to the Scandinavian Vikings were lost. A contemporary of the events, Prince Dmitry Golitsyn, wrote in his diary, "The sovereign ordered that all books that speak of the ancient glory of Russia be found and destroyed. Only those that show our backwardness before his reign should be left." This testimony reveals the true motives behind Peter's actions. He wanted to present himself not as the continuer of ancient traditions, but as the creator of a new Russia. Texts containing alternative versions of the baptism of Rus and church history also disappeared. Documents about the ancient ties between the Russian Church and the Eastern Patriarchates, which could have called into question its dependence on Constantinople, were lost. Evidence of the unique development of Russian Orthodoxy and its differences from the Byzantine model was destroyed. Manuscripts related to eschatological prophecies and predictions about the fate of Russia were particularly carefully removed. Many texts contained prophecies about the coming of the Antichrist, who would destroy faith and traditions. The Old Believers rightly saw Peter as the fulfillment of these predictions, which made the relevant texts extremely dangerous to the authorities. Foreign diplomats also showed a strange interest in ancient Russian manuscripts. The English ambassador Charles Whitworth wrote to London, "It is necessary to ensure that the Russians do not have access to documents that could strengthen their national identity." It turns out that the destruction of the library was part of a broader plan to weaken Russia. Some manuscripts were secretly taken to Europe. They ended up in private collections and European libraries, where they became inaccessible to Russian researchers. Thus, Russia lost not only its historical documents, but also the opportunity to study its own past. European scholars gained a monopoly on the interpretation of Russian history. The search for Ivan the Terrible's library continued in the following centuries, but to no avail. The operation to destroy or hide it had been carried out too thoroughly. Perhaps some of the manuscripts are still kept in secret archives, waiting for their hour to come. But most of this unique heritage was lost forever, taking with it the secrets of Russian history. The construction of St. D. Petersburg was not just the foundation of a new capital, but a symbolic act of breaking with 1,000 years of Russian statehood. Peter deliberately chose a location for his brainchild that was as far away as possible from the historical centers of Russia: Kiev, Novgorod, and Moscow. The new capital was to embody a complete rejection of the Moscow heritage and a turn toward Europe. The location for the city was extremely unfortunate from a practical point of view. The marshy banks of the Neva River, prone to flooding, required enormous expenditures for drainage and soil reinforcement. But Peter was not deterred by either the climatic conditions or the human sacrifices. He wanted a Russian Amsterdam right here, on the border with Europe. Construction was carried out using barbaric methods. Tens of thousands of peasants and soldiers died from disease, hunger, and backbreaking labor. According to contemporaries, the city literally stands on the bones of its builders. Saxon diplomat Georg Grund wrote, "The Tsar is building his paradise on the bones of his subjects, sparing no one for the sake of his dream." The architecture of the new capital completely ignored Russian traditions. Foreign architects created a European city on Russian soil. Domenico Trezzini, Bartolomeo Rastrelli, and Antonio Rinaldi built palaces and churches that could have adorned any European city, but were alien to the Russian spirit. The Peter and Paul Cathedral, the main church of the new capital, was particularly indicative. Instead of traditional domes, it was crowned with a high spire in the Western style. This was a demonstration of a new approach to sacred architecture. The church ceased to be an image of heavenly Jerusalem and became a monument to Tsarist power. The transfer of the capital from Moscow to St. Petersburg. Petersburg had a deep symbolic meaning. Moscow was the third Rome, the heir to Byzantium, the guardian of the Orthodox tradition. St. Petersburg was created as the antithesis of Moscow, a European, secular, rational city. It was the geographical embodiment of a cultural revolution. The forced resettlement of the nobility to the new capital destroyed the centuries-old ties of aristocratic families to their estates and roots. The boyars were forced to sell their ancestral estates and build new homes in a city that was foreign to them. Many went bankrupt, unable to cope with the enormous costs of moving and settling down. The new capital became the center of the Europeanization of the Russian elite. Western fashions, European languages, and foreign entertainment reigned supreme here. St. Petersburg society developed as cosmopolitan, detached from the people. This deepened the gap between the upper and lower classes of Russian society. The city's symbols were also anti-Russian. Instead of traditional Russian patron saints, the Apostle Peter, the Tsar's namesake, was chosen. The city was given a Dutch name rather than a Russian one. Even the main river was renamed from Neva to Neva in the European manner. Everything was intended to emphasize the break with Moscow tradition. The economic consequences of building the new capital were disastrous. Huge sums of money that could have been used to develop the country were spent on building a European city in an unsuitable location. Taxes rose, peasants were ruined, but construction continued at any cost. Old Moscow gradually fell into decline. The Tsar demonstratively ignored the ancient capital, visiting it only when necessary. Moscow's churches and palaces fell into disrepair. The nobility left the city, and craftsmen lost their orders. The heart of old Russia was slowly dying, giving way to a new Europeanized Russia. The creation of St. Petersburg was the culmination of Peter's anti-Moscow policy. The new capital was to become a symbol of the victory of the European principle over the Russian. of modernity over tradition, of reason over faith. And to a large extent, this goal was achieved. St. Petersburg became the embodiment of a new Russia that was ashamed of its past and sought to become part of Europe. The resistance of the traditionalist nobility to Peter's reforms was much broader and more organized than is commonly believed. Behind their outward humility lay a deep rejection of the course toward Europeanization. The old boyar families, who had served the Russian czars for centuries, saw Peter's actions as a betrayal of their ancestors' faith and a betrayal of national interests. The center of resistance was the old boyar aristocracy, led by the Miloslavsky family. They secretly supported Princess Sophia and her supporters, viewing Peter as a usurper who had seized power illegally. Boyar Ivan Miloslavsky openly said, "This German in the Russian crown will destroy Holy Russia." The Tsar's entourage of foreign advisors was particularly painful. Alexander Menshikov, Yakov Bruce, Patrick Gordon, Franz Lefort, all key figures in Peter's entourage, were either foreigners or came from the lower classes. This violated centuries-old traditions and humiliated the noble aristocracy. Church hierarchs also expressed dissatisfaction with the reforms. Metropolitan Job of Novgorod wrote to Patriarch Adrian, "The Tsar is doing unseemly things, destroying holy things, and introducing heretical customs." Many priests secretly called Peter the Antichrist and predicted the imminent end of his reign. The most organized resistance came from the Streltsy, the traditional military force of the Muscovite state. The Streltsy uprisings of 1689 and 1698 were not simply military rebellions, but attempts to stop the destruction of the traditional way of life. The Streltsy defended not only their privileges, but also the old order. The brutal massacre of the Streltsy became a symbol of Peter's ruthlessness towards opponents of reform. Mass executions, torture, and exile were intended to intimidate all those who were dissatisfied. The Tsar personally participated in the executions, demonstrating his determination to see the reforms through to the end. Foreign diplomat Johann Korff wrote, "The Tsar chopped off heads with such fury, as if avenging a personal insult." The peasantry, which made up the majority of the population, also rejected the innovations. The popular uprisings led by Kondraty Bulevin, Ignat Nekrasov, and the Astrakhan uprising of 1705 to 1706 were a reaction not only to the strengthening of serfdom, but also to the destruction of the traditional way of life. The Old Believers became the most consistent force of resistance. They not only preserved ancient rites, but also created an alternative social organization. Old Believer communities lived according to the laws of pre-Petrine Russia, rejecting all innovations. For them, Peter was truly the Antichrist, and his reforms were a sign of the coming of the end times. Intellectual resistance was led by figures such as Prince Dmitry Golitsyn and historian Vasily Tatishchev. They did not openly oppose the Tsar, but criticized certain aspects of his policies and warned of the dangers of a complete break with tradition. Golitsyn wrote, "We must learn from Europe, but without ceasing to be Russian." Women from noble families also showed resistance, especially in matters of dress and family traditions. Many preferred not to appear in public, rather than dress in European style. Tsarina Evdokia Lopukina became a symbol of this female resistance, for which she was forcibly tonsured as a nun. Regional elites on the outskirts of the empire used every opportunity to sabotage central decrees. Cossacks, Tatar nobility, Siberian governors, all resisted unification and Europeanization in their own way. The empire was held together by coercion rather than the voluntary consent of its subjects. The tragedy was that the resistance was fragmented and lacked a unified program. Opponents of reform defended the old ways but could not offer an alternative path to modernization. This doomed them to defeat and Russia to a painful rift between the elite and the people, between the new and the old. The price of Russia's Europeanization proved to be monstrous. Behind the outward glamour of Peter's reforms lay deep social trauma that determined the tragic course of Russian history for centuries to come. The country's population was reduced by a quarter due to wars, forced construction, and people fleeing the unbearable hardships of the reforms. The economic consequences were catastrophic. Huge sums were spent on maintaining the army, the navy, the new capital, and the European court. Taxes rose 3 or 4 times, ruining the peasantry and the merchant class. Traditional crafts fell into decline, unable to compete with European goods, which were imported into the country in huge quantities. Serfdom, which had been limited in the pre-Petrine era, turned into outright slavery. The decree on primogeniture of 1714 and the table of ranks finally enslaved not only the peasants, but also the nobility. The entire country turned into a state machine, where everyone was a cog in the mechanism of absolute power. The demographic catastrophe was particularly evident in the northern regions. The construction of St. Petersburg and the laying of canals claimed hundreds of thousands of lives. Entire villages were deserted when men were taken away for forced labor. French diplomat Campredon wrote, "The Tsar is building his greatness on the bones of his subjects, sparing no one." The cultural divide in society became even deeper. The educated elite spoke French and lived according to European standards, while the people preserved their traditional way of life. Between them lay a gulf of misunderstanding and mutual contempt. The nobility was ashamed of its people, and the people did not recognize the nobility as their own. A religious crisis shook the foundations of Orthodox consciousness. The church became a state institution, and priests became officials. Living faith was replaced by the formal performance of rituals. Monasteries, which had been centers of spiritual life for centuries, were turned into almshouses and warehouses. The old believers went underground, taking with them a significant part of the religious tradition. The psychological trauma was no less destructive. Being forced to change their appearance, clothing, language, and customs broke people's personalities and created a complex of national inferiority. Russians began to be ashamed of their origins and sought to resemble Europeans in everything. It was a form of cultural masochism, the consequences of which were felt for centuries. Peter's military successes were achieved at the cost of tremendous strain on all the country's resources. The Northern War lasted 21 years and exhausted Russia. The victory at Poltava cost tens of thousands of lives, and the conquest of access to the Baltic Sea cost hundreds of thousands. Europe recognized Russia as a great power, but the Russians themselves paid too high a price for this recognition. The educational system created by Peter trained specialists, but not citizens. Young people gained technical knowledge, but lost their spiritual bearings. They became skilled workers, but not creative individuals. This affected the entire subsequent development of Russian culture, which for a long time could not find its own path. Administrative reform turned Russia into a police state. The secret police watched everyone, denunciations were encouraged, and any discontent was severely punished. Society became atomized, and people stopped trusting each other. Fear became the main mechanism of control, which deformed the national character for many years. The result of Peter's reforms was not modernization in the European sense, but the creation of a hybrid civilization that combined external European forms with despotic content. Russia gained an army and a navy, but lost its soul. It became an empire, but ceased to be Holy Russia. This choice predetermined all the subsequent tragedies of Russian history. Summing up the devastating impact of Peter's reforms, we must honestly acknowledge the scale of cultural losses suffered by Russia. The country lost not only specific historical monuments, but also a holistic worldview that had been formed over centuries. The organic connection between the past, present, and future, without which the healthy development of any civilization is impossible, disappeared. The written heritage of ancient Rus suffered catastrophically. Thousands of chronicles, lives of saints, and theological treatises were destroyed or taken abroad. Modern researchers are forced to reconstruct history from fragments, since the whole picture was deliberately destroyed. We have lost the opportunity to hear the voice of our ancestors in its original form. The loss of language was no less serious. Church Slavonic, the language in which the masterpieces of old Russian literature were written, became inaccessible to the educated public. Thousands of words, concepts, and images that expressed the peculiarities of the Russian worldview disappeared. The language became impoverished, losing its spiritual depth and poetic expressiveness. The architectural heritage was barbarically destroyed. Wooden masterpieces that had no analogues in the world were burned in the fires of reform. Stone monuments embodying Russian genius were destroyed. They were replaced by European buildings, technically perfect but alien to the Russian spirit. Cities lost their unique character and turned into provincial copies of European models. The traditional value system was undermined at its very core. The idea of a symphony of powers, of the sacred nature of czarist power, of conciliarism as a principle of social order, disappeared. It was replaced by Western concepts of absolutism, individualism, and rationality. Society lost its spiritual bonds and turned into a mechanical connection of atomized individuals. Folk art also suffered serious losses. Many epics, fairy tales, and songs were declared crude and indecent. The folk tradition was interrupted in the cities and weakened in the villages. The people lost an important means of self-expression and preservation of historical memory. Oral culture, which was the living voice of the people's soul, began to die. Craft traditions were brutally destroyed. Ancient technologies, passed down from master to apprentice, were declared backward. European production methods replaced national ones, destroying guilds and master dynasties. Unique art forms that distinguished Russian craftsmen, such as wood carving, enamel work, and jewelry making, disappeared. The family structure underwent radical changes. The traditional Russian family, with its patriarchal foundations, respect for elders, and orthodox upbringing, was declared obsolete. It was replaced by European models of family relations, alien to the Russian mentality. Family ties were destroyed, and family traditions weakened. The educational system lost its connection with national culture. Instead of educating Orthodox citizens, schools began to produce cosmopolitans who were ashamed of their origins. Young people grew up cut off from their folk roots, ignorant of their native history and traditions. A generation of cultural orphans was formed, belonging neither to Russian nor to European civilization. The psychological damage was the most severe. Russia developed an inferiority complex, which manifested itself in blind imitation of the West and disregard for its own achievements. This complex was passed down from generation to generation, poisoning the national consciousness. The country lost faith in itself and its strength. The spiritual losses surpassed all others. Orthodox civilization, which could have offered the world an alternative to the Western path of development, was crippled at its very inception. Russia became a periphery of European civilization instead of becoming a distinctive center. Humanity was deprived of the opportunity to see what Orthodox modernization could have been without breaking with tradition. All these losses are irreplaceable. A broken cultural tradition cannot be glued back together. Destroyed monuments cannot be resurrected, and a lost language cannot be restored. Peter's reforms dealt such a blow to Russian culture that it has not yet recovered. And this was no accident, but a deliberate policy aimed at turning Russia into a raw materials appendage and cultural province of Europe. The true motives behind Peter's cultural revolution can only be understood by analyzing the international context of the era. 17th and 18th century Europe was in crisis and looking for new markets, sources of raw materials, and spheres of influence. Russia, with its vast territories, natural resources, and large population, was a tempting prize for the European powers. The military threat was only the tip of the iceberg. Much more dangerous was the cultural expansion that was turning the country into a spiritual colony without formal conquest. Peter, without realizing it, became the conduit for this policy. His European advisors exploited the young Tsar's complexes to achieve their own goals. Jesuit emissaries, Protestant preachers, Masonic lodges all worked to undermine Orthodox civilization from within. Their goal was not to convert Russians to Catholicism or Protestantism, but to deprive them of their spiritual core, turning them into a cosmopolitan mass devoid of national identity. Irreligious people are easier to control. Economic interests also played an important role. The destruction of traditional crafts opened up the Russian market to European goods. The destruction of national culture created demand for European models. Russia became not a competitor, but a buyer of European products. This was beneficial to all European powers, despite their mutual enmity. Peter himself was an unbalanced man with many complexes and psychological traumas. His childhood impressions of the Streltsy riots, his stay in the German Sloboda, and his trip to Europe all shaped his belief in the superiority of European civilization. He sincerely believed that he was saving Russia from backwardness, not realizing that he was destroying its soul. European diplomats wrote openly about the need to weaken Russia. The Austrian ambassador, Prince Player, reported to Vienna, "As long as the Russians maintain the unity of their faith and traditions, they remain our dangerous rivals. It is necessary to divide their society from within." Peter's reforms were perfectly suited to this task. The Tsar's foreign advisors played a special role. Jacob Bruce, Patrick Gordon, Franz Lefort, Alexander Menshikov. All of them were connected with European intelligence services and secret societies. Their influence on Peter was enormous, especially in his younger years. They shaped his worldview and suggested directions for reform. Masonic lodges began to penetrate Russia during the Petrine era. Their goal was to create a supranational elite that would place the interests of humanity above those of its own people. Many of Peter's associates were Freemasons or were under their influence. This explains the cosmopolitan nature of many reforms. Financial dependence also played a role. Peter's wars and reforms required enormous funds, which Russia did not have. It had to borrow from European bankers, which made the country dependent on foreign capital. Creditors dictated the terms, including demands for cultural Europeanization. The information war was conducted with particular sophistication. European pamphleteers portrayed pre-Petrine Russia as a savage country, and Peter as an enlightener. This version of history was instilled in the minds of Russians themselves through European teachers and translated literature. People began to be ashamed of their own past and admire European models. The religious factor was key. Catholic and Protestant Europe saw Orthodox Russia as a threat to its spiritual influence. The weakening of Russian Orthodoxy paved the way for Western missionary work. Peter's church reform perfectly served these goals by subordinating the church to secular authority. The geopolitical ambitions of the European powers required Russia to be transformed into a predictable partner rather than an incomprehensible rival. A Europeanized Russia became part of the European system, where it was assigned the role of a supplier of raw materials and a market for European goods. This suited everyone except the Russians themselves. Peter's tragedy was that he did not understand the true goals of his European friends. He thought he was modernizing the country, but in fact, he was destroying its spiritual sovereignty. History proved his opponents right. Europeanized Russia became weaker and more dependent than traditional Muscovy. The reforms turned into a disaster, the consequences of which we still feel today.